I have a copy of the rejection notice. I kept it because I thought someone ought to. It runs to 43 pages, 1 page per species, each with its own official header, its own seal, its own carefully worded reason for declining. The language varies. The Veldorvani Compact wrote in formal high-register administrative script, 11 lines of precise legal reasoning that essentially argued Orath was a resource allocation problem they had no obligation to absorb. The Kethsareth Cooperative filed theirs in plain trade tongue. Insufficient social integration profile, no demonstrated economic utility, resettlement not approved. The Arvath Communion sent a single paragraph from their Spiritual Welfare Commission explaining that their intake quotas served beings of aligned resonance, and Orath did not align. There were species I had never heard of before I opened this file: the Ervathi Reclamation, the Shendorvak Sovereignty, the Pelani Collective, each with their own letterhead, each with their own formulation of the same conclusion. The language was different every time. The meaning was not. 43 of them, the 44th was Earth. I should explain the kind of person I was before this happened, because I think it matters for what came after. I was not an idealist. I had been working intake processing at Station Kethorveth 9 for 11 months by the time Orath's file reached my terminal, and 11 months of compact intake processing will sand the idealism off anyone with a functional capacity for pattern recognition. You learn in that job that the Resettlement Compact exists on paper as a framework for galactic compassion, and in practice as a machine for distributing the beings that no one wants into the smallest possible administrative footprint. You learn that the species who drafted the Compact's founding charter also drafted the weighted intake formula that ensures their own member populations are never the ones carrying the majority of resettlement burden. You learn that the appeals process has a response time of 90 standard days and a resolution rate of under 4%, and that the 4% is not randomly distributed, but correlates strongly with which displaced population has legal representation and access to the founding charter text. You learn other things too, the quieter ones. You learn that the beings in the files are not abstractions even when the system treats them as abstractions. You learn that a case number in a queue is a being who ate a meal today and is going to try to sleep tonight and will wake up tomorrow still waiting for a form to come back with a different answer. You learn that the system's preference for treating them as abstractions is doing real work in the psychology of everyone who processes the files. It is easier to move the queue if you do not think too hard about what moving the queue means, and that you can choose to participate in this or not. I had chosen after 11 months to not participate in it any further than the job strictly required, which is to say I did my work correctly and competently, and I felt appropriately bad about the cases I could not affect, and I went home at the end of my shift and ate my rations and tried to sleep. That is what not participating looked like in practice. I want to be honest about this. I was not fighting the system. I was tolerating it. The difference matters. I was 28 years old, Class 15/Veth Coral Prime on the bioregistry, which is the kind of designation that gets you a second look from the aliens on the station who know what it means, and no look at all from the ones who do not. And I had not yet decided what to do with the information I had accumulated. That is the most accurate description I can give you of my state of mind the day Orath's file came through. The station itself is worth describing, because the physical environment shaped the work in ways that were easy to miss if you had never been anywhere else. Station Kethorveth 9 was a mid-tier compact processing hub, not one of the primary intake centers, which are large enough to have their own atmospheric biomes and multi-species residential sectors, but not a field relay either. It existed in a kind of administrative middle distance. 4 processing wings, each handling different population classifications, 17 species with active liaison offices on station. A commons area with food dispensaries calibrated to 11 different dietary requirements, most of which the dispensary software got mostly right. A transit hub with 3 departure lanes to the nearest primary intake center, 2 of which operated on schedule reliably enough that you could plan around them. The processing terminals were in Wing 2, Row 7, for the class of files I handled, what the compact called general population displacement, non-emergency, no active conflict, no immediate health crisis. The most common kind. The most easily delayed kind. The row had 32 terminals, most of them occupied during standard processing hours, and the sound of it was the sound of fingers on input surfaces and the occasional low exchange between officers comparing notes on a rationale code that neither of them had seen before. It was quiet, as bureaucratic spaces go. The hum of the environmental systems was the loudest thing in it. The day Oreth's file came through, I had 9 other cases on my terminal and a backlog of 7 administrative flags that needed cross-referencing before the end of the processing cycle. It was not a remarkable day. I had drunk 2 of my allotted cups of station-grade stimulant before the 3rd hour, and I was working through the flag backlog with the particular mechanical focus that 11 months of doing the same categories of administrative work builds in a person. I knew what the flags were going to say before I opened them, because they said the same things in slightly varied order 90% of the time. The remaining 10% were genuinely interesting, and I had a small private archive of the interesting ones that I looked at occasionally when I needed to remember that the work had a texture beyond the repetition. I opened Oreth's file at the 3rd hour of the 2nd shift, between the 5th and 6th of my 9 active cases. The header information was standard. Veth-Zareth, singular, adult classification, sex designation corresponding to the Veth-Zareth secondary reproductive caste, which their species uses for administrative identification rather than social description. A distinction I had learned from the taxonomy addendum in our species overview database about 6 months into the job, after I had made the error of using it as a social category in a case note, and been gently corrected by the Veth-Zareth Compact liaison officer, a patient being named Sovaketh who had been explaining the distinction to Earth intake officers for the better part of a year by that point, and who did so without apparent irritation, which I found impressive. Name: Oreth. No family designation, no clan affiliation, no occupational guild record. The photograph in the upper left quadrant of the file showed a being roughly 90 centimeters in height, small by most galactic scales, smaller than most of the beings I processed files for, with a streamlined bilateral form and pale translucent skin, through which the primary circulatory bioluminescence ran in faint blue-green lines. 4 paired fins along the dorsal ridge, lying flat in rest state. The eyes were large and forward-facing, amber-colored, with the quality of careful stillness that I had come to associate with beings evolved in low-light deep-water environments. The particular quality of a being that has learned to spend enormous energy processing information, while spending minimal energy advertising that it is doing so. The Veth-Zareth homeworld had been a Class 3 oceanic world, moderate biological competition, no apex predator equivalent in the evolutionary record, the kind of world that produces species adapted for social cooperation and information exchange, rather than individual physical threat mitigation. The species overview described them as communally organized, non-hierarchical in the formal sense, with a distributed decision-making structure that functioned well in stable environments and required significant adaptation in disrupted ones. Their ecological designation was benign. Their threat assessment classification was Category 1, no individual threat capability, no collective military infrastructure, no weapons program on record. The notation in the biofield read simply, non-combat biological profile, baseline fragile. That phrase, baseline fragile, had its own weight. I had seen it in files before. It was one of the administrative shorthand categories the compact used, and it meant what it sounded like, a being whose baseline biology was not built for the kind of physical environment that most resettlement worlds offered. Not weak, exactly. Differently calibrated, built for a world that no longer existed. I read through the resettlement grounds. Oreth's homeworld had been formally designated as environmentally compromised 3 years prior. The technical language was a placeholder for something specific, a coral cycle collapse that had killed 94% of the primary protein chain in the oceanic ecosystem within 18 months of initial detection. The collapse had been modeled as recoverable on a 300-year timescale. On a 3-year timescale, it had reduced the Vethsareth population from an estimated 12 million to under 40,000, almost entirely through starvation, and the secondary health failures that compound in a population without adequate nutrition across multiple years. The 40,000 survivors were currently on emergency subsistence support from the Compact's emergency allocation, which had a maximum term of 5 years and was now entering its third. The Galactic Resettlement Compact had a formal procedure for displaced populations of this size. The procedure required a sponsoring member species to file an intake affiliation, after which the displaced population would receive provisional resettlement status, ecological transition support, and a 20-year integration period. It was not a perfect system. It was the system that existed. The Vethsareth had filed their application 41 months ago. 43 member species had reviewed and declined. I sat with that for a moment, and I want to describe what sitting with it felt like, because the emotional fact of it matters. It did not feel dramatic. That is the honest answer. 41 months and 43 rejections did not produce an emotional spike in me. I had, as I said, been processing files for 11 months, and I had learned to absorb figures like that with a kind of flat attention that is different from not caring and different from not being affected. It is the emotional register of a person who has been given too much of this kind of information for too long to be moved by any individual instance of it, but who has also not found a way to stop being slowly affected by the aggregate. What I noticed specifically was the calculation. I looked at the 43 pages and I did the arithmetic. 43 member species had reviewed this file, and each one had made a calculation. The calculation had, in 43 separate cases, produced the same output. The Vethsareth, at 40,000 beings and shrinking, did not constitute a resource allocation argument that any of them had found compelling. They had no trade leverage. They had no infrastructure value. Their species profile offered no military utility, no knowledge asset that could not be obtained through other means, no cultural output that rated highly enough on the aesthetic value indices that some species use when they want to admit they are making cultural rather than economic judgments. I read through the rationale codes. They were printed in a column on the summary page, one per rejection, a shorthand taxonomy of the 43 calculations. Resource allocation cap, 14 filings. Integration profile insufficient, 9 filings. Ecological incompatibility, 7 filings, which is the code the Compact uses when a species wants to say that their world is wrong for the applicant without specifying exactly how wrong. Policy hold pending review, 5 filings, which means the filing species had an internal governance process that had not completed and they were buying time. No current intake capacity, 5 filings. Spiritual or resonance alignment criteria, used by 3 species whose governance structures are formally faith-integrated, and who have a documented process for assessing whether a displaced being's vibrational or spiritual profile is compatible with their community. 3 filings. The thing that was absent from the rationale column was a code for too small to matter, but that is what the column meant, in aggregate. 40,000 beings was not a large enough population to constitute a political or economic argument for intake. There was no trade leverage, no infrastructure value, no military utility. The Vethsarith had nothing to offer that would make a member species calculate the intake as worthwhile. I had processed enough files by that point to know what the rationale codes were doing. They were the system's way of producing a clean, documented output for a decision that the system was not actually making. The system was not making the decision. The species in the member roster were making it, one at a time, each with their own reasons, and the rationale codes were how those reasons got laundered into administrative language that would survive a formal record review. Resource allocation cap sounds like a measured, data-driven response. It sounds like the species that filed it had run the numbers and found that the numbers did not work. In the case of the 43rd rejection, I would learn this later. The numbers worked fine. The decision was different from the rationale, and the rationale existed to cover the gap between them. I am not singling out the 43rd filing, because I think it was worse than the other 42. I am noting it because I happened to look it up, and what I found is accurate, and I think the accurate thing is worth saying. They had amber eyes and bioluminescent lines in their skin, and 4 fins that lay flat in rest state, and 40,000 members left and no world to go back to. I pulled the sponsorship addendum up on the secondary screen. I had not used it before in my 11 months at the terminal. Most intake liaisons at our level did not use it, because the cases it was designed for, family reunification, diplomatic attachment, individual skill transfer, did not come through the general population displacement queue. I had read it when I first started, in the way that you read the full documentation when you start a job, even knowing that most of it will not be immediately relevant, and I had filed it in the part of my working memory reserved for available but unlikely tools. The language of the addendum was plain. Any member species in standing with the compact may file an individual sponsorship affiliation for a displaced being provided the sponsoring entity can demonstrate reasonable ecological accommodation, and the individual has no open liability flags. Earth was a member species in standing with the compact. We had been for 9 years. Our compact liaison office was on station Kethorveth 9, which is why I was here and why this file was in my queue. Our individual sponsorship authorization had never been used because we had been a member species for 9 years and had not previously found ourselves in a position where it seemed necessary or appropriate to use it. I read the ecological accommodation clause, reasonable accommodation. I looked up the Vethsarith environmental parameters, aquatic primary environment preferred, a world with significant surface water and moderate atmospheric humidity, temperate to warm climate range, low to moderate UV exposure, no extreme temperature variance. The document noted that the Vethsarith could function in non-aquatic environments using standard humidity support equipment, but that long-term psychological well-being was significantly improved in aquatic adjacent settings. The notes on Vethsarith cognitive function under different atmospheric conditions were detailed. They had been well studied by the Compact's ecological assessment team, presumably because there was an open question about where they could go and what it would cost to support them there. I thought about Earth. I thought about the Pacific coast and the Gulf Islands and the warm equatorial shoreline, and the fact that we were Class 15 on the last independent ecological audit, which meant our biosphere was biologically competitive at a level the Vethsarith homeworld had never approached, but that we had more coast than most of the 43 species who had declined, and that the humidity support requirement was manageable equipment, not an extraordinary accommodation. The individual sponsorship form had 8 fields. Sponsoring member species, check. Liaison officer name and authorization code, check. Individual being sponsored, ORETH case number as filed. Ecological accommodation summary. I spent 40 minutes on this because I wanted it to be thorough rather than cursory. I described the coastal zones, the humidity parameters, the UV envelope, the atmospheric pressure range, the temperature variance data across multiple regional zones. I described the humidity support equipment available through 3 different compact-approved suppliers and attached their specification sheets. I modeled 3 separate resettlement location options with projected adaptation timelines based on the species adaptation data in the compact's own ecological integration studies, because I wanted the form to show that I had actually looked at the question, and that the answer was yes, rather than filing a cursory affirmation and hoping no one examined it closely. No open liability flags. Correct, Orcs file had no flags. Sponsoring entity intake allocation balance. We had never used any of it. The full balance was available. Anticipated support duration. I filed it as 20 years, matching the standard integration period, with a flag for possible extension subject to review. Authorized signatory. I filled in my name and my authorization code. I want to be careful here about what I am saying and what I am not saying. I was not doing anything heroic. Heroism implies a cost calculation, the deliberate choice to accept harm on behalf of another party, the conscious subordination of a self-interest to a competing interest. I did not experience this as a cost calculation. I read the form, and I saw that the form had a field for a sponsoring member species liaison officer to sign, and I understood at a functional level that the field existed to be signed, and that Orcs needed someone to sign it, and that I was the person sitting in front of this particular terminal on this particular day with the authorization to do so. There was no calculation. There was a form with a blank field and a being who needed the field filled in. I signed it and transmitted the completed application to the compact central registry at the close of my shift. I flagged it for expedited review because Orcs file had been in the system for 41 months, and I could see no reason to add further time to that. Then I went home, ate my rations, and went to sleep. The next 48 hours were educational in ways I had not fully anticipated. I should have expected the response from the Veldorvani Compact Administrative Authority, and in fairness to my own judgment, I had expected something. I was not naive about the procedural environment I was operating in. The Veldorvani were the primary administrative caste for the Compact Authority. Slate-purple humanoid beings, methodical and formal bilateral symmetry, 3-fingered hands, a deeply considered approach to language in all official communications. Their administrative office had reviewed the Vethsareth population resettlement application through 3 of the 43 member species' own rejection processes, and had issued guidance on intake formula application twice in the 41 months the file had been in the system. They were not strangers to this case. What I had not anticipated was the speed of the response. The Veldorvani representative, a compact senior liaison named Ketharvek, filed a formal procedural objection to my application within 19 hours of its transmission. The objection was thorough. I will say that immediately and without qualification, it was a well-constructed piece of legal work. Ketharvek had gone to the trouble of reading my application carefully before responding to it, which was more than I could say for some of the administrative interactions I had had in 11 months of this job. The objection ran 12 pages, clearly organized, with proper citation form throughout. The first ground was that the individual sponsorship addendum had not been designed for population displacement resettlement cases. It had been developed, as Ketharvek documented with citations going back to the addendum's drafting committee minutes, to address individual cases of family reunification, diplomatic service attachment, and skill transfer agreements. Applying it to a case arising from a population displacement event that had already been formally reviewed under the standard population resettlement protocol represented, in Ketharvek's framing, an improper use of the instrument. The instrument had a purpose. This was not that purpose. The second ground was related to the first but procedurally distinct. The 43 rejections filed under the standard population resettlement protocol constituted a completed review. Reopening that review through an ancillary procedural mechanism would create an inconsistency in the compact's intake record-keeping framework, since it would allow any individual sponsorship filing to effectively override any number of population protocol decisions. This was not, Ketharvik argued, how the instruments were intended to interact. The third ground was institutional. Earth's transition from provisional to full member status had occurred under an expedited review process, and our liaison office's individual sponsorship authorization had been carried over from our provisional authorization without a formal scope confirmation for full member status. There was a standing interpretive question about whether that carryover was technically valid. This question had not been resolved. In the absence of a formal resolution, Ketharvik argued, my filing should be held in abeyance until our authorization scope was confirmed. It was, taken as a whole, the kind of objection that a careful, competent official files when they want to generate review time. 90 days minimum if it went to the standard resolution process. Longer if the resolution panel found a reason to extend. I read it through twice. Then I pulled up the actual text of the addendum. Not the compact authority's summary of it, not the intake guide's paraphrase, not the drafting committee minutes that Ketharvik had cited. The original operative text, as ratified by the founding charter member species and carried forward into the current operating protocol without formal amendment. 9 pages. I had read it once when I started the job and had not gone back to it since. I read all of it now. The addendum's operative language, in its original text, read, any displaced being without current resettlement status, not any displaced being in a category excluding population displacement cases, not any displaced being whose case had not been previously reviewed under a different instrument. The limitation Ketharvik had cited in his first ground of objection was not in the operative text. It was in an administrative commentary document. A compact authority internal interpretation note from the 7th year of the addendum's existence. That had been drafted to provide guidance on the addendum's intended application and had never been formally incorporated into the operative text through the charter amendment process. The commentary document was not the law. The operative text was the law. The commentary had narrowed the operative text without formal authority to do so, and that narrowing had become the working assumption of the intake system, because no one had gone back and checked. I want to emphasize this point because I think it is important. The commentary document had been in circulation long enough that it had started to function like law. Officers cited it. Supervisors referenced it. The compact authority's own guidance documents paraphrased it. The assumption had become load-bearing without anyone ever having verified whether the foundation was solid. This is not a uniquely Veldorvani failure. It is the kind of thing that happens to any institution that runs long enough on unexamined assumptions. The particular assumption here happened to cost the Vethsarith 41 months. On the second ground, the 43 rejections had been filed under the Population Resettlement Protocol. The individual sponsorship addendum was a formally separate instrument. Ketharvik's argument that completing a review under one instrument precluded filing under another would require a formal precedent establishing that the two instruments operated as a unified decision-making system. No such precedent existed. The instruments had separate procedures, separate eligibility criteria, and separate authorization chains. His argument, examined against the actual text and case registry, did not hold. On the third ground, the standing interpretive question about our authorization scope was real. It existed. I had seen it referenced in a liaison office communication 12 months prior, but a question in abeyance is not a prohibition. It had not been resolved in the negative. Until it was formally resolved, our authorization scope was presumptively intact. Ketharvik's third ground was arguing that an unresolved question should be treated as a resolved negative, which was a significant procedural leap that no compact authority ruling had ever endorsed. I filed my response to the procedural objection in the same shift I received it. The response was 14 pages. I sourced the operative text of the addendum directly, with the relevant passage quoted. I identified the administrative commentary document and its status, interpretive guidance, never formally incorporated into the operative text. I cited the founding charter language on instrument separation, the provision that established the population resettlement protocol, and the individual sponsorship addendum as distinct mechanisms with distinct purposes and procedures. I pulled the case registry and found the 3 most recent compact authority rulings on authorization scope for new member species during unresolved interpretive review periods. All 3 had found authorization presumptively intact. I cited all 3. I also included a note at the end of the response. This is not something you are supposed to do in formal compact correspondence. The protocols are procedural documents, not personal ones, and personal observations belong in separate channels. I included it anyway, 1 sentence, addressed to Ketharvik's attention directly. I note for the record that the individual in this file has been in the resettlement queue for 41 months, and that the expedited review flag on this application has been filed on that basis. I was not appealing to Ketharvik's emotions. I was putting the 41 months into the formal record, where it would be part of the evidentiary file that the resolution body would read. The note served a procedural function. That was why I wrote it. Ketharvik responded in 6 hours. The response was 4 pages, and the tone had changed. I want to be precise about this, because I think the nature of what happened between Ketharvik and me in the course of this correspondence is one of the more interesting aspects of the whole situation, and I do not want to flatten it into a story about bureaucratic obstruction overcome. Ketharvik was not a villain. I cannot say that plainly enough. He was a careful, conscientious official who had processed hundreds of resettlement files, and who had, I am nearly certain, filed his objection in genuine good faith. He had believed the administrative commentary represented the operative standard. He had not checked whether it did because no one in the compact processing system had checked whether it did, and the system had been running on the assumption that it did for long enough that checking had stopped feeling necessary. When I showed him the text, he looked at the text. The second response conceded the first ground without formal acknowledgement. The Veldorvani method of acknowledging an error without creating a record of having been wrong is to simply not mention the point again, to proceed as if it had never been raised. The first ground disappeared from the second response entirely, with no explanatory note, no correction, no reference. I understood this as acknowledgement. Ketharvik had checked the operative text and found what I had found, and he had the professional integrity to not continue arguing a position he now knew was incorrect. The second response restated the second ground in modified form, now acknowledging instrument separation as a valid framework, but arguing that the 43 population protocol rejections constituted persuasive precedent even in the absence of a formal binding precedent. This was a weaker argument, and Ketharvik knew it. The modification itself was evidence of that. The third ground was restated, in significantly more moderate language. I filed my response to the second objection the same day, 9 pages. On the second ground, I pulled the case registry and identified 11 previous individual sponsorship applications that had proceeded following population protocol reviews under other member species. The precedent ran against Ketharvik's position, not for it. The cases established a consistent pattern of treating the 2 instruments as genuinely separate. On the third ground, I filed a formal request for the standing interpretive question to be resolved on an expedited basis, which under compact procedure required a resolution body response within 30 days rather than the standard 90. And which I justified on the grounds that the authorization scope question was the only remaining substantive basis for the objection, and that resolving it in a timely fashion served the interests of both the processing system's clarity and the individual in the file. The formal objection process ran for 22 days. On the 22nd day, the Compact Central Registry issued a procedural determination. It found in favor of Earth's application on all three grounds, in terms that were clear enough that there was limited interpretive room on any of them. The individual sponsorship addendum applied to population displacement cases on its plain operative language, without reference to the administrative commentary. The 43 population protocol rejections did not constitute a formal or persuasive bar to a separate individual sponsorship filing. Earth's authorization scope was intact pending formal resolution of the interpretive question, which the determination cross-referred to a standing review panel with a 60-day resolution window and a recommended expedited schedule. Earth's application was approved for processing. I filed the ecological accommodation documentation the same afternoon, the humidity support equipment specifications and procurement pathway, the aquatic access scheduling framework for the resettlement location options I had identified, the atmospheric transition protocol with a phased timeline. I had looked up the equipment suppliers before the determination came through, because I had seen no reason not to be ready. The unit cost was significant, about what I made in 3 months, which I noted in the support request without comment, and I filed it as a resettlement support request under Earth's member species intake allocation, which was untouched and available. The determination produced a volume of incoming communication to Station Kethorvath 9 that was larger than anything the station had received in its administrative history, or so I was told by the station coordinator, who said it without any particular emotion beyond mild surprise. Most of it was from other liaison offices. They wanted to understand how the procedural determination had been obtained. They wanted the text citations. Several of them, I noticed over the following weeks, were looking at their own intake queues and finding files that had been waiting for something similar to what I had found in the operative text. The determination had not changed the law. It had clarified that the law had always said what it said, and that the commentary had never been the law, and that anyone who wanted to use the mechanism that the law had always provided was entitled to do so. There was a portion of the incoming communication that was not from liaison offices. Some of it was from displaced beings whose files were in the queue, from individuals, and from representatives of small populations who had heard through the Compact's public case registry that a determination had come down clarifying the individual sponsorship addendum scope. The messages varied in length and register, and in what precisely they were asking. Some were formal inquiries routed through standard channels. Some were not. I read each one. I responded to the ones I could respond to directly in my capacity as Earth's liaison officer, and routed the others to the appropriate processing channels. The station's case coordinator asked me at one point whether I wanted assistance managing the volume, and I said I would flag her if the workload exceeded my processing capacity, and she looked at me for a moment in a way that I did not fully interpret at the time, and said that was fine. I did not ask for assistance. I processed the queue. There was a message from Kethorvath, private channel, not the formal correspondence system. He would not put it in the formal system because the formal system created a record, and this was not the kind of message he was going to put in a formal record. It was 3 sentences. It noted that the determination had been correctly reached and that the compact process had functioned as it was designed to function. It noted that the authorization scope question had a 60-day resolution window, and that in his professional judgment the resolution would go in Earth's favor. The 3rd sentence: the individual in the file is fortunate in the matter of who was staffing your terminal that day. I read that 3 times. I did not think Kethorvath meant it as personal flattery. He was making a systemic observation. He was saying, in 3 sentences, the same thing I had spent 11 months accumulating the evidence for, Whether a being in the intake queue gets a form signed depends on who happens to be at the terminal. The system does not self-correct toward justice. It moves in the direction that the people in it push it, and most of the people in it are tired or habituated or are working from assumptions they have not had occasion to examine, and so it moves slowly, and most of the beings in the queue wait. I wrote back one sentence, noted and thank you for the case. I have never met Orath in person. This is the detail that people find strange when they hear about the case, and I have thought about why they find it strange. I think they expect that the story has a different shape, that it involves a direct encounter, a face across a table, a conversation, a relationship with a traceable arc. They expect that the human in the story had some specific experience of Orath as an individual that catalyzed what she did. The photograph. The 41 months, a field with a blank line in it. That is the complete account of my relationship to Orath at the moment I signed the form. I cannot tell you that I knew Orath. I knew a file. I knew a photograph of amber eyes and bioluminescent lines and fins flat in rest state. I knew 43 pages of careful procedural language that had arrived at the same output 43 times. I knew a species overview that described a being built for a world that no longer existed. I knew that the field at the bottom of the form had a blank line, and that the blank line had been blank for 41 months. I received a communication from Orath 3 weeks after the application was approved, forwarded through the formal compact system to my station mailbox. It was brief. The Vethsarith use a compressed communicative style that I was not fully calibrated to read, and I spent longer than I should admit parsing it with the aid of the species communication guide. In the Vethsarith idiom, the message was a form of debt acknowledgement. The closest accurate translation in standard galactic trade tongue is something like, I record that a debt exists that I do not have the capacity to repay, and the recording is itself the act the debt requires. I sat with that for longer than I sat with most things that year. I thought about what it said about the Vethsarith, about a species that had evolved in an environment where cooperation was the survival mechanism, where individual resilience was low and collective interdependence was the load-bearing structure, where the acknowledgement of obligation was not a prelude to repayment but a social act in itself, a form of currency that could be paid without being able to repay the underlying debt. The statement of the obligation closed the account not by resolving it, but by witnessing it. The acknowledgement was the reciprocity. I thought about what that meant for a species that had spent 41 months accumulating rejections. Each rejection was a communication. Each one said, "We see your obligation, and we decline to witness it." 43 communications to that effect, in 43 official headers, with 43 sets of procedural rationale. The administrative language varied. The meaning did not. What the Vethsarith had been receiving in aggregate was a message that the galactic community had a process for witnessing their situation, and had decided, 43 times in 41 months, that the process did not require an answer. I thought about the mechanics of that, for a being built the way Orath was built. The Vethsarith debt acknowledgement structure was not incidental to how their species operated. It was, from everything the species overview described, close to the center of it. A species whose survival framework was cooperative, whose individual resilience was calibrated low and whose collective resilience was calibrated high, would necessarily have a different relationship to obligation and acknowledgement than a species built for individual competition. The acknowledgement was not a courtesy. It was the closing mechanism of a social transaction. Without it, the transaction remained open. Without it, the thing that happened stayed unresolved in the cultural ledger in a way that, I think, would have felt different to Orath than it would feel to me, more unfinished, in a structural sense, in a way that mapped onto something deeper than just an unpaid debt. 41 months of being told that nobody needed to close the transaction. I filed the communication in Orath's case folder, closed the folder, and opened the next file in my queue, That is what I mean when I say I was not an idealist. The next file had been in the queue for 17 months, and the being in the photograph had 3 dependency-aged offspring, and the rejection column had 26 entries. I opened the sponsorship addendum. The authorization scope question was resolved in Earth's favor 38 days after the determination, 22 days ahead of the resolution panel's deadline. I do not know the full explanation for the accelerated timeline, but I note that Ketharvik filed a comprehensive and unsolicited legal analysis of the authorization scope question to the resolution panel on the 12th day after the determination. The analysis was excellent. It was also not favorable to the position his own compact authority had taken in the third ground of the objection. Ketharvik had looked at the text and filed what the text supported. I do not know if I would call what he did courage. I'm not sure that is the right category for the act of a careful, methodical official who looks at evidence and reports what the evidence says. It seems like a thing that should not require courage. The fact that it sometimes does is, I think, the most accurate diagnosis of why systems like the one we were both working inside tend to accumulate the kind of sediment they accumulate. The resolution gave Earth's liaison office a formally confirmed individual sponsorship authorization scope with no outstanding interpretive questions. It also included a procedural annotation, not binding, but entered into the formal record, recommending that the Compact's General Counsel Office review the individual sponsorship addendum for potential amendment to clarify its application to population displacement cases. The annotation noted that the Orcs case had identified a gap between the operative text and the administrative commentary that had been generating unnecessary procedural friction for an indeterminate period of time. The gap had been there for the whole time. The addendum had always said what it said. The commentary had narrowed it without authority. The narrowing had become the operating assumption, because the system had been running on it long enough that the assumption had stopped feeling like an assumption. It had started feeling like a wall. I continued processing files. Over the 6 months following the determination, I filed 27 individual sponsorship applications under the mechanism that the Orcs case had clarified. 19 were approved. 4 were in active appeal. 4 were declined on grounds that I assessed, with as much objectivity as I could bring to it, as genuinely valid ecological incompatibility that was real rather than administrative, accommodation requirements that exceeded our member allocation, specific medical support needs that our intake infrastructure could not provide. The system has constraints that are not manufactured. I am not arguing otherwise. I am claiming it had one specific point of structural friction that had been costing beings like Orath for an indeterminate number of years, and that the friction turned out to be removable. The Compact General Council's review of the individual sponsorship addendum was completed 11 months after the Orath determination. The amendment was 3 sentences long. It replaced the administrative commentary language with operative text that explicitly applied the individual sponsorship mechanism to population displacement cases. Ratified in the standard founding charter member review cycle, carried forward into the current operating protocol. I did not do that. The determination and Ketharvik's legal analysis and the procedural annotation did that. I filed 1 form and responded to 2 objections. The downstream consequence of those 3 actions is a thing I was not calculating when I performed them because I was not running a strategic agenda. I was at a terminal. The file was in front of me. The field had a blank line. Oreth resettled on Earth's 3rd largest island chain, in a coastal latitude zone with significant marine access and the kind of atmospheric humidity that keeps the bioluminescent lines running at full saturation. I know this from the quarterly integration reports that pass through our administrative feed as part of the standard resettlement monitoring protocol. The reports are brief and formal, filed by the regional intake coordinator rather than by Orath. They note integration status, ecological adaptation progress, employment record, community contact metrics. The most recent one listed in the employment field: liaison consultant, compact resettlement advisory board, secondment from Earth member allocation, first cycle. I read that twice and then a third time. The board advises the compact central registry on intake protocol development. I am aware of its function because its protocol recommendations occasionally generate documentation that passes through the processing system. Oreth had 41 months of first-hand experience with the intake protocol from the perspective of the being the protocol was designed to serve. That is a complete set of qualifications for an advisory role, and the most complete set that has existed on the board in its history, so far as I am able to determine. Someone understood that. I am glad they did. I do not know who made the appointment. I have not asked. It is the kind of thing I would rather not know the specific mechanics of, because the specific mechanics would probably involve either a straightforward recognition of obvious qualifications or a set of political calculations I would find depressing to learn about, and either way it happened, and the fact of it is what matters. Oreth is on the board. The board shapes the protocol. The protocol shapes the queue. This is the correct order of things, and it arrived at the correct output, and I am content to let the process be opaque in this one instance. I pulled up Oreth's intake file. Still open in the system, resettlement files stay active through the full integration monitoring period. The photograph was still in the upper left quadrant. The amber eyes. The bioluminescent lines faint blue-green in the skin. The fins flat in rest state. The same photograph that had been in the file for 41 months before I opened it. I looked at it for a moment. Then I closed the file, opened the next one in the queue, and started reading. There is one more thing. The 43rd rejection, the last one filed before Oreth's case reached our terminal, was from a species called the Kethorvath commune. A cooperative governance species, aquatic adjacent, with a coastline that the intake database listed at approximately 4,000 kilometers, and a formal ecological stewardship tradition rated at the second tier of the Compact's environmental compliance scale. They had filed a resource allocation cap rejection. I looked up their allocation cap figure when I was building the ecological accommodation case, because I wanted to understand the math of the case I was making. Their resource allocation cap, at the time of filing, showed them at 61% of their available intake capacity. They had room, they had appropriate coastline, they had the ecological profile and the stewardship tradition and the aquatic adjacent biome. They filed the cap rejection because 61% utilization gave their administrative system a theoretical buffer against future demand, and they had calculated that the buffer was worth more than the application. I am not angry about this. I have said that the human never gets angry, and I mean it in the full sense of the statement. The anger is not a response I reached, not a register I arrived at. I processed the information and understood it and stored it in the part of my working knowledge that contains the structural facts about how the system functions, and I moved on. But I kept the 43 rejection pages. I still have them, in a case archive folder on the processing system I use for long-term file retention. 43 pages of careful, procedurally correct language that arrived at the same conclusion from 43 different directions over 41 months. Sometimes at the end of a processing cycle, when the queue is down and the flags are cleared and the stimulant has worn off and I am about to close the terminal for the night, I open the folder, not to reread the rejection language. I have the rejection language memorized well enough not to need to. I open it to look at the photograph. The amber eyes in the upper left quadrant, the fins flat in rest state. The bioluminescent lines running faint blue-green under the skin of a being who was, in that photograph, 41 months into waiting for someone to fill in a blank field on a form. The Compact's intake assessment form has a field at the bottom of the sponsorship addendum. The field is 7 centimeters wide and contains, in small gray administrative text, the instruction, Authorized Signatory. The instruction is not asking whether you are authorized. It is not asking you to verify your credentials or to assess the strategic implications or to model the downstream consequences. It is telling you that you are the authorized signatory, that this field exists because someone has to fill it, and that someone is the person currently sitting at this terminal with the authorization code to do so. The field does not care how many species filed rejection before you arrived. It does not care about the administrative commentary language that nobody verified against the founding charter text. It does not care about the procedural objection that is coming. It only has a blank line, and it is waiting. I signed it. I would sign it again. The rest was paperwork,